Welcome to an extra slice of the pie. I'm Ben Krause, Executive Director of the University of Chicago Becker Freeman Institute for Economics, pursuing the twin mission of frontier research and global impact. In this show, we're talking about the most pressing matters of the day and connecting them back to the stock of knowledge in economics. My guest today is Nobel Laureate Lars Peter Hansen. Here at UChicago, he is the David Rockefeller Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, Statistics, and the Booth School of Business, and he also serves as the faculty director for the Macrofinance Research Program. Now, Lars is perhaps best known for his work developing the Generalized Method of Moments, or GMM, and applying it to market trading. This tool has become one of the most widely used methods for estimating models in economics and finance, and its power comes from allowing us to do something without needing to do everything simultaneously. For this work, Lars shared the Nobel in 2013 with Eugene Fama and Robert Shiller for their empirical analysis of asset prices. In our conversation, we ended up talking about the underlying need behind this earlier econometric work. The reason GMM was and continues to be valuable is that we don't know everything. There is tremendous uncertainty in the world, and Lars has spent much of his career working to formalize how we think about and account for uncertainty in economics. His work in this moment is particularly timely. So let's dig in with Nobel Laureate Lars Peter Hansen. Welcome, Lars. Thank you for joining us today.
Sure, it's my privilege.
So to get started, I understand that you and I might have something in common when it comes to our grade school report cards, and in particular with regards to our revealed respect for authority during that time. I don't know if you could maybe share a little bit about your experience in early days in school.
So mine wasn't in grade school; it was actually in high school.
Okay.
It was my senior year in high school. My parents moved me from Michigan to northern Utah at an awkward age. I was at 16, and I was perhaps not the happiest camper in the world. But I had an English teacher, and this was during the Vietnam War era, and there were these big events. There were like one on campuses. One was in Kent State, and one was in Jackson State. The National Guard was called out, and they were perhaps somewhat naively trained, and they actually shot some of the student protesters, and it led to quite some controversy. My high school teacher got in front of the class and said, "If I were a member of the National Guard, I would have pulled the trigger without hesitation."
Oh my goodness.
So at that point in time, double check marks start coming forward. Does that respect authority? I kind of did some things that were less than polite following up, and that did not make the teacher so happy. But this kind of triggered a not very good relationship with the teacher.
I can only imagine. Wow. And what was it like coming up in that time and studying in that time?
I mean, during the Vietnam War era?
Yeah.
Oh, the 60s in general were a very wild time because we're having cities were burning because of racial protests. There was the Vietnam War era. I mean the country was not very happy. It was lots of discontent in a variety of ways, and thankfully we survived it and pulled ourselves out of it. But it was a very troubling time for sure.
Yeah, and how do you think that's influenced your career path as you've made the decisions you've made moving forward from that time?
Interesting. So when I went to college, I had an interest in mathematics, but I also had a long-standing interest in kind of the social sciences and social problems. I quote, at that point in time, wanted to be socially relevant, whatever that means exactly. I started off as taking a fair number of political science classes. Along with explorations like chemistry, which my dad was a biochemist and but I took political science classes and they weren't so inspiring at the university that I was at. So I pursued my interest in mathematics, and then by the junior year became convinced that it would be better for me to shift to economics. So I basically took my first economics class my junior year. There's some faculty that designed a very accelerated program for me to get me ready for graduate school. But it was this notion about, I liked quantitative analysis. I liked using mathematics, but social problems were on my radar screen.
That was very interesting. So kind of thinking about this respect for authority,
Yeah.
So you were cited in at least one Nobel Prize prior to winning the Nobel Prize yourself. I think most would recognize you're very much an authority in this space and now subject to the respect and trust of students and the broader public. A lot has been written recently about declining trust in science and scientists. And, some might hide from uncertainty in a moment like this, really try to emphasize their findings as being unambiguously clear. But much of your work, what I've seen you do is emphasizing the importance of uncertainty and communicating that uncertainty clearly. I've read that you said excessive confidence in our projected understanding of the longer term erodes public trust. So I was hoping you might be able to tell us something more about what you think about this relationship between uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, and public trust.
Yeah. I think it's a very important challenge for sure. Hayek, when he won the Nobel Prize, wrote an essay that was about the limits of knowledge. And it's a very intriguing essay to read. There's portions of it that I don't like very much, that I would disagree with. He basically says that econometrics, a field that I have been very interested in, was a complete waste of time. He said that mathematics was a language of clarity, but not for quantitative analysis.
Got it.
Those are positions that I don't agree with. But he has this passage about influencing policy and the notion that the public may well have demands for people with the answers, and this is going to lead certain scientists or economists or the like to come forward and to project things with excessive confidence, and that could indeed bias the whole policymaking arena. Now, I think this becomes the trust comes into play because if you have multiple scientists, in particular economists or other type of scientists, one person may state an opinion with great confidence, and someone else with also great confidence, but they're very different opinions. And so the public can say, how can these economists have all this wonderful confidence when they're projecting very, very, very different messages out there? So I do think that there's a sense in which it can also erode confidence. So even though people may like the notion, or at least politicians may like the notion they should project things with great confidence, the knowledge base that we have will not always support that. And so an important challenge to me is how we can integrate discussions of uncertainty in ways that don't undermine the whole policymaking discussion. And maybe this has to occur at the level of advisors to politicians and not to the politicians themselves that communicate with the public, but to actually have conversations about, look, here's the limits of our knowledge, and they'll accept the fact that you don't have to know things for sure to act. You may want to act now just based on possibilities of bad outcomes in order to protect against them.
I like that a lot. And I was reading recently a piece that you did for the Chicago Booth Review called Purely Evidence-Based Policy Doesn't Exist.
Yeah.
And in it, you tell us why we should be wary of economists or anyone else that says just let the data speak for itself.
Yeah.
So why is that? Why should we be wary?
So I think the data, in some sense, never speaks for itself. It requires some type of conceptual framework to interpret it. And I think it's kind of there's lots of discussions about we do evidence-based policy. What's great that people use evidence to think about policy, but the conceptual frameworks they use are also very, very important. And for many policy questions, I think climate change is an example about this. The evidence can be rich in some places, but very thin in other places. And then it's all the more important that we have conceptual frameworks, and we talked about the subjective uncertainties that go along with those. So I just think there's kind of a false dichotomy between it's all about evidence. And not thinking about the conceptual frameworks. It requires both, and it requires both in kind of really meaningful ways.
Yeah, and what are the values that we get? We talk a lot actually at BFI, largely because of being rooted in your founding, about the importance of the interplay between models, conceptual frameworks, and data.
Yeah.
And what are we gaining? What is the importance of rooting ourselves in those conceptual frameworks?
Yeah, for me, a single model is a way to engage in what I think of as quantitative storytelling. I write down this model. It's not literally true. If we're literally true, it would be so complex we couldn't even make sense out of it. We don't. Yeah. It's a very complex reality out there. It abstracts from some things and focuses on others. We're interested in it because it tells us. We think it tells us a very useful story. But then there's this issue about multiple models. In a recent paper, I kind of took a quote by St. Thomas Aquinas that said, "Beware the person of one book," and I crossed out book and put model. And the idea is that for a lot of problems, we don't have a single framework or a single model to think about things. And so it's also important to weigh across what might be a range of different possible models, maybe each tell a little bit different story. And then it's the issue of how much attention do we want to pay to each. There's a bit of a bias in the way that the publication process works within economics, perhaps other disciplines as well, that it's my job to write down a single model and to tell you why this is a really good model. And so there will be model comparisons there, but there's sometimes a little bit slanted, towards the model that the researcher is trying to sell. There's somewhat less really serious work on putting multiples on models on the table in a more balanced way and trying to kind of make sense out of how much attention or credibility we ought to give to each of these models. And I think that's a very, very important part of what needs to be an input into policymaking. I mean, unless we have really full confidence that there's really one model out there that we all agree upon. And I think in most situations that's just not correct.
Yeah, so I think this is actually one of the great insights that I get from reading your work is really characterizing, helping us disentangle kinds of uncertainty, right? So there's risk, there's ambiguity, and there's misspecification. You talk about all three of them. So I'd love for you to just walk us through each one of those and explain. So when we think about risk, what should we have in mind?
So the term risk is used quite broadly, but I find I like a sharper statement of it in order to draw these distinctions you're talking about. So for me, risk means the following. It means we know probabilities, but we don't know outcomes. Example would be you flip coins. Another example would be you roll dice. The probabilities of getting for a given dice roller, like a 6 for a heads or tails, or the probability a half. I mean, but those are situations in which we have lots of confidence in the probabilities, and so it's all about. I think about that as risk, and a lot of what we teach in microeconomics has to do with about risk aversion, and even in finance we talk about risk premium and the like, and based on models in which the only uncertainties are about outcomes and not probabilities. So that's one form. Another form is this ambiguity, and this comes back to this multiple model issue. Yeah. That there's multiple models on the table. Historical evidence might help me assign credibility to the different models, but there's also some type of important subjective inputs about making guesses as to which model I think is the more credible one. And maybe this uncertainty about how much attention you want to pay to each of these models. And so that's where model ambiguity comes into play. I've got these multiple models on the table, and I'm not quite sure how much weight to attach to each one of them. Data is partially informative, but it may not give me a complete answer. Then the third one is model misspecification. It's kind of certainly true that a model is wrong by construction. It's a simplification. It's an abstraction, so it's not much of a deep insight. But the uncertainty comes into play is I'm using a model that's a simplification, this abstraction, and what are the boundaries of a credible use of that model? At what point in time do I have to be worried about the model is misspecified versus when can I just say, yes, it's a simplification, but it's good enough for my purposes.
Yeah, and so you've got this risk, so you've got this uncertainty about the model, or within the model, I guess. And you've got the ambiguity, which is the uncertainty across models. Right. And you've got this misspecification, which is really ambiguity or uncertainty about the model itself. Right. So we've got all of this uncertainty. Yeah. We're recognizing all of it. So how then can public policy be most effectively crafted?
Yeah. So economists like the other phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So there's certainly a case in which we still have to have some important inputs in here.
Yeah.
And when we do this in practice, I think of this as a kind of type of sensitivity analysis. I look across what happens when I kind of weight different models, assign different type of weights to different possible models, and kind of see how sensitive the question at hand is to those type of movements. Is this a highly sensitive, or maybe maybe that type of ambiguity doesn't matter very much for the particular question. So it's nice to have methods that help us figure that out. The other one is the hardest one is probably the model misspecification. So there we have to figure out hypothetically different ways the model might be wrong. We have to somehow limit it, though. We can't do these sensitivity analyses and allow anything to happen. The same thing with model misspecifications. We have to bound them to some extent.
Yeah.
So we can do a sensitivity analysis subject to some type of penalization, some type of bound or the like, and then the methods are all about trying to do that without having to take each model quite so literally and not pretending we know probabilities.
And when we're doing these sensitivity analyses, essentially what we're doing is we're running the numbers through the different kinds of models and establishing, as you said, a bounds. We're trying to see a range of possible outcomes that might happen given the uncertainty across each one of these specifications.
I think there's an additional step to it than just that. We certainly do have to have some way to limit and bound things, and but for us, then the question is, if there's a particular policy problem on the table, a particular social decision or a particular individual decision on the table, then you can ask which pieces of this uncertainty really matter for that particular question. So what's important in our analysis is to start from a question or to start from a policy challenge, and then to use that challenge to help do the uncertainty quantifications here. So in some situations, you can imagine these uncertainties are very high dimensional. They can come from a lot of different places. In the case of climate change, you can document uncertainties coming from sources like geosciences, from macroeconomics, from damage assessment, from environmental economics, from financial considerations about discounting and the like. What you want is a framework to say, among all these sources of uncertainty, what really matters, and which pieces of this do I really have to be concerned about? And so once we put a policy challenge on the table, we can start doing those type of calculations. And then when I figure out the places, the components of that decision process that are highly sensitive, maybe I can go out and figure out ways to get better evidence in the future. Maybe I have a researcher haven't thought hard enough about the types of inputs here, and maybe I can do a better job of it. But it's meant to get at questions like this. This notion of uncertainty quantification, it shows up all over a place in various different sciences. We want to take it one step further. We want to take that uncertainty quantification and then ask, once we have a purpose on the table, then we can start really figuring out which components of that uncertainty really matter for that question.
So I've heard you describe your work as operationalizing what decision makers are already doing. And I think in a lot of ways, the way you just walked us through the different kinds of uncertainties, it made that really clear. So I'd like to get back to understanding, where did your inspiration for all of this work come from? How did you start thinking seriously about uncertainty?
The initial part of my research career was about the following. There was this I kind of grew up in the heyday where the so-called rational expectations revolution was having a big impact, not only on macroeconomics, but on kind of economics across the board. And it was a tremendously powerful paradigm. But it's a paradigm that adopted something as a simplification. All models are simplification, so this adopted the following simplification, that we're going to presume economic agents inside the models we build have figured things out. So they don't know outcomes, but they know probabilities. So there's extensions of that, but in the simplest form, it was that. And then including
their past experiences, right? There's kind of a full set of information.
I think nobody thought this was like literally true. It was just models are approximations. So here's the simplification. And it turned out to be an incredibly powerful simplification in policy analysis because it really challenged this notion of building policies that were systematically fool people. So once you impose rational expectations, this idea that we're going to fool people over and over and over again, they'll never learn anything, is just kind of off the table.
Right.
And so that alone was a very powerful insight and a very important part of this rational expectations revolution. Okay, then I as a econometrician want to think about looking at models in which the agents inside my models have things figured out. And then I start struggling with figuring out myself, trying to figure out what's a good model here. Some initial stabs, we had like overwhelming evidence that some baseline models were really pretty badly misspecified and the like. And so I'm sitting here as a econometrician struggling to figure out what the heck is going on here. What are better models to put on the table? But yet inside my models, these people have everything figured out. And so that was the tension I wanted to say. Well, maybe I need to start thinking about what goes on inside the models more, and not just what goes on outside. And so in my Nobel essay in the JP, I talk about this inside uncertainty versus outside uncertainty. Yeah. And how the interaction between those can be really quite important. So first part of my career was all about this outside uncertainty, and then I gradually started shifting towards this kind of what can we do to give explorations inside the model that match struggles that I'm seeing that I'm experiencing as a researcher myself. And at the same time, in part because of the great collaborators I had, it was that they were exposing me to different literatures. I have a long-term collaborators, for instance, Tom Sargent, and there were insights coming out of control theory that was wrestling with the same issue. Models are misspecified. What do we do about it? There's a long-standing issues coming out of statistics, robust statistics, where that there are these subjective inputs about how much to weight models, but those we may only know very crudely. What do we do about it? There are some developments in applied mathematics that seem to provide tractable tools to address some of these questions. And so it was possible to kind of look at what's going on in a variety of different literatures. That there's a literature in economics that's just trying to figure out how to think about uncertainty in broader terms, and from a more so-called axiomatic basis. Now, what an axiomatic basis means is I'm going to write down a set of postulates for what's like rational or prudent behavior, and from that figure out a way to represent decisions. So it goes about the problem very, very differently than a control theorist would go about it, but trying to see at these different approaches and figure out what you could extract from these different pieces and put together in coherent ways was a really interesting challenge.
And could you say, so you build off of control theory, which I don't think many of our listeners or audience will be very familiar with. So maybe you could say a little bit about control theory to help us understand what you're talking about there.
So control theory is of interest to economists interested in studying in investigations of dynamic economical systems. And so if we have people, investors inside our models, or even policymakers sitting in dynamic environments, okay, we want to capture them making decisions. Okay, so control theory was what came out of engineering. Yeah. And was trying to get these operational tools for how to make decisions in these kind of dynamic environments with randomness in it. And so there's kind of a natural connection between that and the tools economists which economists would use. So once economics started putting more and more attention onto dynamics, the connections to control theory became all the more important. But so control theorists were very concerned about what they write down their models, but they know they're not quite right. And so what do they do about that? And that's where the so-called robust control came
And they're largely building off of the idea of feedback mechanisms, right? Writing down systems that allow for the output of a system to then influence the next step in the system in this dynamic way.
Yeah, so like there may be a bunch of different, so it's what economists would call state variables, but these are things that evolve over time, but they evolve over time as a whole system of things. And so instead of writing down equation by equation for how each of the variables behaves, you write down a joint system, and that's where these feedbacks start showing up, what you're talking about, and then you study that as a joint system. Yes.
So you end up then looking at things like the trade-off between acting now and waiting to learn more.
Yeah.
And I know you've been doing work in particular with respect to climate change on this question. And so
Right.
could you say what your work has been indicating in that area?
Yeah. Very little of the climate change literature has been involved in trade-offs, which are of the type you're talking about. Even though in policy discussions, it's kind of they're explicitly or implicitly. Like I think many people would say, well, climate change may be a problem, but we really don't know whether it's a big problem yet or not. Maybe we just wait until we figure things out. Why do we necessarily have to act now? Why don't we wait until we have a lot more confidence in that and understand better just what the magnitude of that problem is? And that's an interesting perspective. But on the other hand, if you wait, it might be much more costly to change things then because you really may have already damaged the economic opportunities to the extent that things aren't very easy to reverse. And so it could be very, very costly to have this delayed intervention. So maybe you ought to be doing something now on the possibility of these potentially bad outcomes down the road, even though they're quite a ways down the road. And so that's kind of what the trade-off is about. It seems to me like it's a real trade-off. I think this is one of the important uncertainty trade-offs. And so the type of climate models that we build, we try to design them so that trade-off is really there. That on the one hand, you may want to act now. On the other hand, down the road, you may figure out that damages, oh my gosh, they're really good from climate change are awful, or maybe they're not quite so bad. But that's stuff that we kind of figure out later. But that doesn't close down when to do some stuff now. And so I think that's a very important trade-off, and we're kind of designing our models to help us think better about that trade-off.
Excellent. Now, I made a bit of an allusion to this before, but for those who aren't aware, you're the founding faculty director for the Becker Freeman Institute, as well as for the Milton Friedman Institute before that, and you were one of the faculty on the esteemed panel that were put together by President Zimmer to set all of our work in motion nearly 20 years ago. And so when you kind of think back over this time, what are some of the results of this work, the fruits that you're most proud of?
So, so I got charged originally to be head of the faculty committee that was supposed to conceptualize this at the Freeman Institute.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're aware, but at the time the university then announced their interest in it, there was a massive faculty protest to this.
I am. And the reason I'm aware is because you've written up this great history, which we'll put a link for everyone so they can read it. It's really really well written.
And so there was just it was an interesting experience. I part of my frustrations in that during that experience was I wanted to meet with the whole committee that was trying to put together this protest and say, can't we talk this out? And eventually they sent me a subcommittee of 3 people, and we had an interesting conversation, but not the 3, but none of them were the leaders of the movement. So it was they were pretty committed to protesting no matter what. So I kind of and during this time there was this very eminent anthropologist who said something that kind of resonated with me, because I think it was kind of a part behind all this. He said, Lars, when you're debating the Milton Friedman Institute, you keep telling us about Milton, that people are kind of misrepresenting Milton Friedman, and that they really need to put it in a better context to understand what was going on here, and the like. And that Milton Friedman, you're saying Milton Friedman was actually a very eminent economist, independent of his reputation for being a policy advocate, which is all very true. And he said, what you don't understand is that Milton Friedman is a symbol. Symbols do not have to be factually based. So you hitting us with these facts is it's just not it's not going to fully resonate with us. And so once that was the argument, and I actually think it was, I think this gentleman, this scholar, was being perfectly honest with me. I have to give him credit for that. I didn't know how to respond anymore. I just didn't know what to do anymore. So there was an all faculty meeting, with was a massive number of people assembled to discuss matters, and then and then there was a minor renaming of the Freeman Institute that seemed to me quite
Right.
trivial, and then then everything went forward. But that was an interesting experience. Yeah, so we started Milton Friedman Institute. I basically had 2/3 staff member, and we were working out of about 2 offices, and we kind of gradually built things. And some of the early events I really liked were ones that were really trying to be different and trying to be unique, because there's lots of conferences out there. And so there are ways. The more we build conferences that cross sub-disciplines, I thought that would be the ones that would be most advantageous. Because Chicago, for a long time, Chicago economics was kind of known for kind of not being sub-discipline segmented.
Right.
And so we really viewed that faculty committee viewed a really charge of this original Milton Friedman Institute and subsequently the Becker Friedman Institute as a way to knock down subfield boundaries and to really kind of promote intellectual interaction across these various different subfields. And I think we had some progress along that dimension, but I think that was kind of that was a very important original aim of the institute, and it's certainly grown to a whole lot more than that by now.
I will say personally, I'm incredibly grateful for all of the work you did to make all of this possible, and we're incredibly proud to continue carrying this torch forward. Now, we've I think clearly established in this conversation that there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, and so recognizing that, I'm still interested in what is the next question that you're wrestling with. Where do you think your research agenda is going from here?
That's a very interesting question for sure. I'm better off telling you what I'm going to work on for the next year or two than to tell you what I'm going to work on the next 5 or 6 years.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, it's a very adaptive process. I have to kind of feel my way to where I think good progress can be made. There's 2 directions of research I've been doing recently that warrant, I think, a much further development, and I'm happy to describe both of them. One is I have some collaborators who are expert economists, but also experts in the Brazilian economy in particular. And we've been doing some research related to the Amazon rainforest, building dynamic spatial models and thinking about how to incorporate uncertainty considerations in those models. And these are models that would say, well, you take the rainforest in Brazil and figure out what's a good way to allocate land. So land can be used for agriculture, and land can be used to grow trees that absorb carbon. We have imperfect measures of productivities of those, which that's where the uncertainty comes into play. We're not fully certain of those uncertainties, but we have information about them. And then how do we design kind of prudent allocation of that land over time? And then we're inputting the so-called social cost of carbon as an external number and trying to see how far we push it up in order to really have major impacts of saving the Brazilian Amazon. And the thing that's interesting about that research is at a fairly low social cost, one can make huge gains in preserving the Amazon.
It's really striking.
And so that's what we've been working on so far. But climate change in the Brazilian Amazon interacts with something else, and that's biodiversity. And there's kind of known interactions between biodiversity and the ability of rainforests to kind of absorb carbon. And so that's the direction we're currently thinking hard about. And I think economists have done not a lot of work on biodiversity. I think there's a lot of open questions about what the best way to integrate biodiversity in economic models are. But that's something that my collaborators and I are keenly interested going forward and trying to see how that changes our perspective on some of the issues about the Brazilian Amazon. So that's one area that interests me, at least in the short run. Another one is we kind of stumbled across this a little bit by accident, but it kind of has taken a life of its own. There's a lot of discussions, not all, but a lot of discussions of climate change, and even ones that include uncertainty, that treat research and development in a very mechanical way. Either they abstract from it completely, or it's just some exogenous process that gradually makes us enhances our ability to have green energy be economically viable. So we thought it was important to endogenize that. We're not the first people to think about how to do R&D and its ramifications. We're not the first people to think about our R&D when it comes to climate change. But our angle has to do with the uncertainty component of it. And we thought we'd feature what I think of as big project uncertainty. Situations in which there may be some initial big scientific investment that maybe eventually incorporates the private sector. It just starts working towards economic viability. That eventually really is a major way to address climate change. Kind of an example of this is something like nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is highly uncertain. It's not going to be economically viable at the scale it needs to be within the next couple of decades. It's going to take a while.
Right.
And how long it's going to take is uncertain. And it's so how does that factor into this whole treatment of uncertainty and climate change? How does R&D uncertainty factor into it? So we added this source of uncertainty into our analysis, and out popped the following result. When you are less sure about things, less confident, I think of this whole issue of kind of uncertainty and how we approach it as in some sense a lack of full confidence. When you're less confident in the in these kind of probabilistic models you might have, you actually wanted, for say R&D successes, you actually want to do more investment rather than less. And so this is a little bit counter to some of the work that shows up in option pricing, some of the work that shows up in investment under uncertainty. But the problem we're analyzing is really quite different. And there's and so we've now been thinking hard about that. Now, our analysis to date has been stylized. Right? When we think about one social investment, the place we want to take it is now, suppose you have multiple social investments out there, how should you weigh those?
Invest over the portfolio,
yeah. But back to what goes on here, there's kind of two forces in play. One is that, well, the one that makes you more, one says, well, I'm not sure when this is going to pay off. That's a force towards maybe I don't want to do quite so much. And that force is in our model for sure. But then you have to think about the payoffs. In a world in which lots of uncertainty, if you have this major discoveries that address climate change, you just eliminated a big chunk of uncertainty.
Right.
So the payoffs to a success when you're concerned about uncertainty are all that much larger. And that second channel, the payoff channel, tends to dominate our calculation substantially. So we kind of document these two forces and then kind of show, at least in some cases, the one force can really dominate the other one. And so kind of taking that type of insight and thinking across multiple different investments for society and the like in terms of addressing climate change and other problems, these is something that intrigues me, and I think I hope be thinking more about that going forward.
Excellent. Well, we'll be very excited to follow that work as it comes out. Are you ready for the lightning round?
I'm ready for anything.
That's what I like to hear.
Give me your best shot.
That's right. We're going to see how he stands up. So what books are you reading right now or you would recommend?
Oh my gosh. Next question.
Okay.
Let's see. What books? In truth, outside of my area of current expertise, I'm not doing quite as much reading as I should be doing. There's lots of intriguing things to read out there, though, so I would have to think about that. I'm not going to give you a quick answer to it.
No worries. What course changed your life as a student?
Course. What course changed it? So in graduate school, it would have been a couple courses by my two people who kind of basically served as as mentors early part of my career, Tom Sargent and Chris Sims. They had very, very different teaching styles. Tom Sargent was this highly charismatic teacher that would get everyone gung-ho and enthusiastic. Chris had a different teaching style. Chris Sims would go in there and with somewhat limited preparation, and he would sketch out ideas. This would be in the more advanced courses, and then try and develop them, and would kind of do some of this right on the spot. and was actually pretty good at doing it on the spot. But they were never quite complete.
Right.
And then
right.
and then there'd be give and take between between how to take these interesting ideas and really kind of complete the arguments. And he was open to those type of discussions. And so I actually learned a lot by him posing these very interesting problems and solutions and trying to think thinking a little bit more depth and formally about how to address them. So for me, it was a tremendously important learning experience as well.
Yeah, like literally workshopping on the spot.
Yeah. But the other idea that they really put on the table that was very important for my education was that there's this literature in econometrics, and this was all very kind of, it was a very literature in which they would include things like dynamics by putting in so-called lagged variables in various different places and the like. And both Chris and Tom were of this view that you really should be thinking that the right mathematical framework was a theory of stochastic processes. And so there's this big literature in mathematics, extensions of probability theory, that studies stochastic processes. And these are stochastics of systems that evolve over time, and that can be vector systems as well. And really thinking through macroeconomics from the perspective of this kind of both in terms of the models itself, but also in terms of their empirical implications by this kind of more stochastic process view, at the time was quite original. I mean, these days it's kind of obvious to all graduate students, but
right.
but the point I was a graduate student, this was far more innovative, and it was a very powerful way to think about things, and I got a lot from that too. So
and the two of them went on to win the Nobel Prize as well.
They did, yes.
Yeah. In large part from that work that they were putting together. And you were there witnessing it in the moment, it seems.
So part of a career involves luck. So when I go to graduate school, I go to Minnesota. I actually turned down Chicago.
I didn't know that.
I mean, for not obviously smart reasons, but I turned down Chicago, I go to Minnesota, and it turns out to be a great decision for me.
Yeah.
But the faculty that I was aware of at Minnesota were not Tom Sargent and Chris Sims. They were young faculty just then establishing their reputation. It was a much older cohort that I was familiar with, and so I go there, and I'm just lucky enough to be able to learn from Tom and Chris in the early parts of their career, in which they're doing this exciting research, and so I was able to watch the early stages and kind of try to jump in and contribute.
That's fascinating. Now, the last question that I have for you is, if you had to make a pie with the current contents in your house, what would it be?
I've done a pie podcast before. It seems like I had the same question.
It's very possible. It's very possible.
It seems like I had the same question before. Yeah.
But you have
one of my favorite pies is pumpkin pie.
Oh, I love pumpkin pie. Yeah. So you've got some pumpkins sitting at home right now.
Yeah.
Well, Lars, thank you so very much for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate this.